Last minute zen before we hit record. I love it. Um, what's up, Noah? Thank you for coming on the pause so last minute, man.
Mr. Jack, thank you for having the podcast so last minute.
Of course. Yeah, so we were just talking before we hit record about following your intuition and just trusting the present moment and not overly planning. And I was telling you that I'm somebody that's very structured and orderly. Like I plan out very strategically, like every work block during the day. And I'm trying to do a better job of surrendering just to the flow of life. And so when you texted me today, like, yo, sorry I didn't see your message. Do you want to run a podcast today? I instantly felt this resistance in my mind, like, oh, I'm not ready, I'm not planned, I'm not scheduled. I was gonna do this other thing, but I was like, fuck it, let's just rip it and let's see how it goes. So I think I admire that a lot about you. It's just you told me you don't schedule anything. You're just like completely trusting your intuition.
No, dude, once again, it's all intuitive. So it's really hard to put the intuitive nature into thought and into word. But yeah, when I schedule things, they just don't have that same level of enjoyment. The anticipation kind of wears off the dopaminergic response that I get from that activity, right? Because it's normally like I'm inspired to do a podcast that morning, right? But then I have to schedule 2 weeks in advance. By the time that podcast comes, I'm probably in a completely different headspace. So I think that's a really big factor. I've always liked the spontaneity of things. I think it does come down to self-awareness. It's very possible that you perform better when you do have a structured routine, when you have all of the variables in place and accounted for. For me, I noticed very early on that wasn't the case, right? We used to have essays in school, and we had two forms of essays. One, where you got the prompt in advance and you prepared for it. And two, when you got the prompt the second you sat down to actually write the essay. And I always performed better and I enjoyed the spontaneous essays more. So I knew very early on, it's like, I love being thrown into that pit. I don't like the preparation component. I don't like the anticipation component. Just throw shit at me. Let's do it last second. And it seems to have been working quite well so far.
Where do you think that comes from?
Brain damage, most likely, developmental disorders. I'm just kidding. I people just have different proclivities, right? Like the personality spectrum is very broad and expansive. So some people just naturally desire different forms of behavior more than others. And a lot of that's hereditary. A lot of that has to do with epigenetics. But you have to understand that our ancestors all evolved within different contexts, right? So there were traits that were selectively bred due to the constraints and concerns of that environment. So maybe someone who was in a very structured, regimented, rigorous environment, the people that were able to have those routines and have those structures in place had a higher likelihood of success and subsequently a higher likelihood of reproduction. Now you take someone and put them in more of a sporadic feral environment based off of culture, a culture that values those personality traits, that's going to be more selected for. And then there's just genetic variance as well. There's just so many components to it. Asking where it comes from is far less important than asking yourself, where do you stand on these spectrums?
Mm. Yeah, the nature versus nurture thing is interesting because I'm thinking back, if I asked myself the question, where does my more structured, rigid thinking, planning brain come from? And I think it comes from childhood. Like I played quarterback in football from the time I was 5 until the time I was like 19. And so it was always like thinking ahead, planning, etc. And so I've carried that now into my work, but I see this middle way, this balance between structure and spontaneity as the ultimate calling card for like my productivity. I notice when I try to schedule every hour of the day, creativity goes out the door. But if I'm structured in the morning and then spontaneous in the afternoon, that seems like the sweet spot. So for you, like when do you notice your creativity is the highest? Because I think that's one of your defining traits as a writer, creator, etc.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And there's something I want to preface before we discuss creativity and fluctuations of brain states throughout the day. And that is the fact that just because you are one way, just because you find that you operate best in chaos or in structure, does not mean that you should completely forego becoming proficient at operating in that other manner. As a matter of fact, when I was the highest performer, just in terms of output and busyness and performance, like when I was when I was the most effective version of myself, I was very regimented. I had a structured routine. Every morning I woke up at this time, right? I read this many pages. I had literally every single piece of my life figured out and structured. And it worked great, but it did take away that certain part of me, that spontaneous part of me that I believe is deepest to my core. So I learned how to do that. And in doing that, I acquired these neurological adaptations. I acquired this ability to be a lot more flexible, both cognitively and, representatively in the world. And that was very, very important. So I do recommend that everybody goes and does the opposite of what they think their nature is to experiment it and to gain those neurological adaptations that are going to make you more powerful and more effective.
I love that. Yeah, you're making me think back to a time in my life where I completely went to the other end of the spectrum because my whole life it was sports, football, structure, discipline, school, all of that stuff. And for 3 months, I went and backpacked Europe with literally no plans, nothing. And I just like naturally gravitated towards reading and writing. And those were parts of myself I'd like suppressed my entire life. And so I put out a tweet this morning, which is funny timing. I was like, I think every young person should take a 3 month hiatus and just completely go get lost in the world and wander around because you'll find parts of yourself that you didn't know existed when we're caught on this hamster wheel. We're caught on this treadmill of like school, job, internship, next thing, next thing, next thing. And you're just stuck achieving. So you never have that space to like step back and find those different parts of yourself.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And there's a reason that so many people recommend that to 20-year-olds. Because all 20-year-olds are trying to find themselves. They're trying, they feel this urgency, which is good. But every single successful person is just like, dude, slow down, go explore. And I think that's really huge. I believe that my one saving grace and the reason that I was able to more or less build a lifestyle that's completely conducive to my unique personality traits is that I always gave myself space. It doesn't matter if I was in school, when I was working on, earlier businesses, when I was an intern, whatever I was doing, I was always looking at how can I get the work done as effectively as possible so then I have all this extra space. Everyone else was working 8 hours, I was working 2 hours, and we got the same
Yeah.
things done because I just got really good at being efficient there. So I always had so much space. I was never busy. I never stayed up past like 9 p.m. studying. I never pulled like 12-hour days, 10-hour days working. Like I just always gave myself space because that is part of the work. That personal development, that self awareness and self exploration is probably one of the highest level things you can do for creating more, especially on a longer time frame.
Yeah. And I think the defining trait there is like you're willing to question things and think outside of the box. Like, you don't, why do I have to study for 8 hours and stay up all night? Why can't I just like be really efficient in this time block? So, I mean, your entire life is kind of this going against the grain story, like leaving the US, traveling around, just living nomadically. Was that always a part of you, like since you were a kid, or did that develop?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a multitude of factors there. Like we talk about nature versus nurture, right? And nurture follows nature, nature follows nurture. I think they're entirely interdependent. But you got to kind of look back, right? Especially between the ages of 0 to 7. That is when you have like you're so malleable. You're a sponge, right? Every single life experience and life event is going to have a significant impact on your psyche, right? That's why trauma, the word trauma is huge. And like I look back, I'm like, I never had any big trauma, right? And I like haven't really had to worry about that. But the trauma is just the fact that when you're in that stage, the smallest, most minute things are going to have really significant impacts on you. So looking back at like what was my first memory, and by the way, I want to preface this as an activity that everyone should do is they should play archaeologist with their past. I spent probably a year and a half just obsessively trying to figure out who I was. A lot of times I was spinning wheels. Eventually, I just gave up, and that's when I figured everything out. But I spent so much time just going back and reassessing every single life experience. And it was hard for me because I had a few concussions that made my memory Swiss cheese. Like there's still large parts of my memory that I never was able to get back. But essentially going back and identifying what are those earliest memories. And I have two very distinct memories. I was in daycare and I was in a crib. And I hated being in a crib. I felt so suffocated. I was crying, I was screaming, I was yelling, and I couldn't get out. So I felt very constricted, right? And ever since then, like ever since I've been a little kid, I hated being confined. I hated going to, like anywhere that I couldn't get out. So that was my first memory. And my second memory was me riding my little tricycle, chasing the moon in my little cul-de-sac and just feeling that expansiveness of just being able to go wherever and just like having all of this freedom and space. And now I look at my life now, I'm extremely free, right? I'm outside 24/7. I just spent an hour dirt biking in the jungle, completely free, essentially reliving that same experience as a child on a daily basis and avoiding at all costs being in that crib once again. So to answer your question, I think it was always that way, always oppositionally defiant. My high school quote was the worst I could be is the same as everybody else by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And like I just think I thought about that recently, but yeah, it's always been hardwired in me, I think.
Wow. Those are very early memories. I need to do that exercise myself. I'm thinking back to like, what are my earliest memories? I'd have to actually really give it some thought. And I think something I noticed in your Telegram chat, in your Twitter, all this stuff is you talk about the importance of taking time to just ponder and taking time to just think. And so can you explain like your thinking behind that? Like what does pondering mean and how often do you do it and what's the importance?
Yeah, dude. Oh my God. This morning I had a great pondering session, and I am very susceptible to external stimuli, right? My best period of life, when I had the best mental health, when I had the best mental function and cognitive focus, was when I deleted all social media and I did not let myself use anything stimulating. I didn't use YouTube, I didn't use Twitter, I didn't use Instagram, I didn't use Snapchat, right? Because that brought my stimuli baseline down so low that I would read an article and it would be like the most stimulating thing ever. And we have to think back, just 20 years ago. None of this attention economy bullshit, this cheap stimuli was a thing. And I look back on a lot of old school movies. I was watching Curb Your Enthusiasm a few months ago, and those early episodes where everything was so much slower. People go to a restaurant and no one's on their phone. A guy's just there drinking coffee and reading the newspaper for like an hour. And I'm like, I'm envious. I am so envious of that because we go outside now and we see everybody on their phone. It is impossible to remain focused and really observe your surroundings, let alone observe what's going on in your head. So no one is going to make that space for you. You have to make that space for yourself. Everything in this world is vying for your attention, is trying to take away that peace of mind that comes with sitting down and pondering. So every morning I go and I do not bring my phone. I go on a little joyride. I go to the beach. I take a walk, and then I go to a coffee shop and I just sit. I'll keep a little piece of paper with me. I'll keep this little notepad with me and a piece of paper. And I don't force myself to write. I just use that to catch ideas that I want to come back to later. And I just sit there and I just absorb and I ponder. And it is crazy, first of all, how much friction and resistance there is to you just sitting down and doing nothing. It's crazy. Like the desire for me to want to grab my phone for no reason is absurd, even when it's not there. But that, in my opinion, is the one way that you can really garner a strong sense of self awareness, but not just awareness of yourself, awareness of the world around you, to understand the nuance and the beauty and the intricacies of where you are. And I think that is going to be one of the best things that people can implement to regain this sense of presence that we have subsequently lost in this modern, hyper-stimulating environment.
I 100% agree. And looking back, there's so many parallels too. Like my life started to turn around probably at like 20 years old in college. So only like 2 years ago when I decided to delete everything off my phone. I was so addicted to TikTok. I was so addicted to Instagram. I was just a complete like mindless NPC, like every consumer out there. And I deleted everything. And in those couple months where I deleted everything, I gravitated towards books because it's like, okay, what's everything's relative. All your stimulation is relative. And so, like you said, reading an article, reading a book, whereas if you're scrolling TikTok all day, you're not going to be able to read a book for more than 5 minutes. Like you have TikTok brain, you're like, oh, I'm just going to check my phone. But if you cut those things out for a period, it's so powerful. And I think even doing this on like a regular ritual basis, like maybe every couple months, take a couple days, take a day, don't use your phone. I can look back at like 5 to 10 days in my life where I intentionally kept my phone at home and went outside all day and just walked around as some of the most important days in my life. And it's pretty wild to think about as a thought experiment. Like, I bet 90 to 95% of people listening to this have not gone a day without their phone in the last 15 years. It's wild.
It's absurd. It really is absurd. It is an addiction. It's not treated like the other addictions because it's socially acceptable. If I were an alcoholic, I would remove all alcohol from my house. I wouldn't hang out with my alcoholic friends. I wouldn't go to environments that promote alcoholism. But it's not the same with social media, right? Because my livelihood and your livelihood is predicated on this incredibly powerful tool. But yeah, I do think that is probably the best thing that everyone can do is like on a weekly basis, spend one day where you have little to no exposure to any digital stimuli. Every quarter, maybe go on a camping trip or just an extended mini staycation where you go 2 to 3 days without anything. I really like doing that with camping and just being in nature. Nature gives you that healthy, proper stimuli that makes it go by a lot quicker than if you're just sitting alone in your room. That's a factor there. Every morning, you got to think when you go to bed at night, that is 8 hours of destimulation. Your dopamine receptors are re regulating back to a homeostatic baseline. If you wake up and immediately go on social media, you spike that right back up. So I wake up, I hide my phone at night, and I've gotten really good at hiding it. I couldn't find mine until noon today. I put it in one of my Tupperware drawers, in the bathroom. So it was very hard to find. But anyway, do that, go out. And then the issue is people will do like a dopamine detox. And then once they're done with that, they'll immediately go back to TikTok. And that completely ruins all of that stuff that they just did, right? You can't reincorporate that stimuli right after, right? If you go sober for a week and then you get blackout drunk on day 8, that defeats the entire purpose. So you got to treat it that way. Start in the morning. your stimuli baseline is going to be the lowest then, and you can really taper into more productive and effective and slower paced things in the AM.
I love that. And I'm doing some self reflecting here, and I don't take enough time away, even though I know I should. It's one of those things I know I should do, step away more. But I find it hard when your business, your writing, your entire brand is based off of social media to be able to actually step away from that, and get your mind off of it. So for you, like as a creator, as a social media guy, somebody whose business brand is all based off of social media, what advice could you offer to other creators, entrepreneurs, writers, whatever you want to call them, to be able to step away without the neurotic thoughts and without like the guilt of being away from messages, emails, and all that?
Yeah. Well, listen, first of all, this is something that I learned really early on. It's setting expectations and making a precedent of asynchronous communication. So I've never been good at, communicating offline. If I want to talk to someone, I hop on a phone call or I send voice notes. I set the expectation that I am not going to respond immediately, right? I have segments of my day that I'll likely respond because it's an action that I can bundle together. And that's fine, right? Nobody has a problem with that. People think that, oh, if I don't respond immediately, this person's going to think badly of me. No, they're not. If you don't set those boundaries and if you make it like you're everyone's bellboy and you need to respond immediately and then you stop, that's when there's problems there. That's the same with virtue signaling online, that you're a really, really good person and that you're like the most altruistic person ever. And then people meet you in the real world and you don't meet those expectations. Now they think you're an asshole. But if you're just honest and you're a little bit blunt online and maybe you're an asshole online and then people meet you in person and you're a really nice guy, they love it,
Yeah.
right? Like they're so much happier about it. So it's about setting expectations first and foremost. The second thing here is content creation, in my opinion. It's not about making better content, it's about having better ideas. That, in my opinion, is what the real needle mover is. I'm sure you've probably seen my content, and a lot of people have also noticed my content's very lo fi, right? There's no editing involved. There's oftentimes spelling errors. There's no fancy, thumbnails or clips or anything. It's just raw information. So I
It's
set
raw.
that
Yeah.
precedent, I set that baseline. Listen, you don't want someone to follow you because you have a flashy thumbnail. You don't want someone to follow you because you say like big words in your hooks and your scripts, right? Sure, that may help you gain followers, but the real quality audience are not looking to be, you know, bamboozled by big words and hooks. They just want real authentic information. So I believe authenticity is key there. Focus on having better ideas, not better content. And the way that you get better ideas is spending more time just in your own head. I don't have Twitter downloaded on my phone. I don't have any social media downloaded on my phone. Yet, like I post every single day. And I think if I did have Twitter on my phone, my posts would get worse because I'd spend more time consuming than creating.
I love it because you're going against the grain of what every single social media guru, even including myself, sometimes teaches, like in these courses and stuff, of like, you need to be commenting 100 times a day, you need to be active all the time. Where in reality, the people who actually separate themselves and stand out as niches of one or people that can't be replaced are the ones who are going completely against all the quote unquote rules and just creating their own path. That's what I really admire about your brand too, is it's just so raw and you could tell like in the moment you're just like writing this stuff, you're not like planning it with a content calendar and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so funny, right? And they say like that is the method of growth that's crucial, but I've grown brands for some of my health clients, product clients, and I've done the same model where it's super raw, super information based. We don't follow anyone back. We don't even respond to comments, let alone DMs, and we're able to blow up brands like that. So I think it is authenticity. People want authenticity. They want raw. People can tell when you're doing things relatively effortlessly because it feels authentic. They don't like all the fluff. That is one way to win. There's many ways to win. There's a bunch of ways to skin a cat, but that's the one that's most sustainable for me because I can't be bothered to do all of the trivial redundancies of creating content. I don't care about creating content. I care about sharing ideas. So let me remove all the fluff. Let me ask myself, what would this look like if it were easy? What would it look like if it were easy for me to post every single day? Well, if I just posted the thing that's on top of my mind when I'm just automatically distracted, just with as little friction as possible, it will be ridiculously easy for me to post every day. And I made that decision when I started posting online, and I haven't stopped posting since. There's not been one day where I woke up and I'm like, fuck, I got to post a tweet today. Because I
Mm-hmm.
have ideas every day. So if you can minimize that friction between ideas and getting that to the masses, you have a constant information and content stream.
Yeah, and I think the key thing there that I'm observing is the content creation isn't separate from you, it's just an extension of you. Like you're very aligned with it, where most people, they feel so much friction because it's forced, because they have to play this persona or character. And it brings to mind this one Instagram you post you had a long time ago. It was like, this is crazy because I didn't even research for this podcast, but I just like have consumed your stuff for a while. But you were like, it took me 5 years to master my body, my health, etc. But it's taken me 5 years to master my mind, or something like that. So I'm curious right now for you, like, what was that shift where you went from focus so much on health to mastering your mind and like actually pursuing some form of self actualization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was always pretty in shape, right? Since I was a little kid, I was into fitness because I for better or not for better or worse, definitely for better, I got really good really early on at just identifying what things were in my control. There were so many things out of my control. I struggled with depression all throughout like my childhood and in like my 20s. And like fitness and health was that one thing that I had control of. I had immediate and entire control over what I did with my body and what I put into my body. So I used that as an outlet, right? And I used that as an outlet for a long time, but I never really addressed the mental component of it. I was on antidepressants for a really long time too, which I talk about because they destroyed my serotonergic system. But
Mm.
I think that enabled me to never really have to dig deep. And I'm going to be honest, a lot of things just came easy to me in life. Like I never really struggled with a lot of external stuff. And the SSRIs kind of they make you completely apathetic to everything. So I never really dug deep and tried to expand on like my mental health, right? Because I didn't need to. It was kind of just like taken care of by super physiological levels of serotonin. But when I got off of those drugs, I got off of those drugs after college, and at that same time, I was having a huge identity shift as well, and all of those things that I was kind of neglecting about like my personal development, who I was, and that identity were kind of just thrown in my face, right? Because the identity that I created for the last 7 years, 8 years was completely predicated on me being in a school environment surrounded by my peers with a lot of partying and the ability to be relatively shallow and still succeed socially. That factor, as well as having like my brain chemistry altered. So you remove those two variables, and then you're kind of just stuck with this shell of an identity. You have no idea who you are. So I had to
Mm.
work really, really, really hard to figure out and recraft that identity in a new environment, completely away from all of those other variables that were very much, you know, forming me into who I thought that I was.
And what has that identity shift been like? Like, what would you say is the before and after?
I didn't care at all. I still don't really care about much, but I'm pretty carefree. But I shouldn't say that. I got there's this good saying. It's like take yourself lightly, take the world seriously. I kind of really align with that. I think that was Miyamoto Musashi. Big fan. Got him tatted on my thigh. But anyway, the question was, what was the big shift like in terms of identity?
Yeah, what would you define your identity as now?
Oh fuck, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it is. I think it's counterproductive to try to classify your identity, right? And it's really hard to maintain egotistically ambiguous, right? Because we want to align our identity with something. That's why someone will be so frantically hopping from like one identity to another. Today, like they do it with everything with diet, right? Like today they're a vegan, tomorrow they're a keto, like the next day they're carnivore, and they put it in their bio. They make it their entire identity. We're all grasping for some semblance of self, and that's great, right? Because it removes a lot of the busy work of trying to craft your understanding of yourself and your world. But I think it's in the long term, it is worth going through the effort of just trying to craft your own identity. It's very difficult. I don't like I think the only thing that I can say about like what my identity is I'm extremely curious. I'm always dissatisfied, and I enjoy the rapid growth process, and I'm a sucker for novelty. That's all I can say. I
Mm.
just like experimenting new things. And one of those experimentations and experiences is identities, right? Like okay, today I'm like this type of person. I'm really carefree, laid back. Tomorrow, what if I'm super regimented and like serious? Today I'm relatively, stoic and I don't show a lot of emotion. Tomorrow, what if I'm just like overwhelmingly emotional and positive and experimenting with all of those on a long enough time frame, you really just become this, ubermensch for lack of a better term that can kind of encompass all of these different beings.
Yeah. No, I love that answer. And it brings to mind there's this article by Paul Graham. So he's like a VC founder, and it's called Keep Your Identity Small. And it stayed so top of mind for me recently. Like, I write about it in almost every single newsletter how we put these labels on ourselves to like feel some sort of status. Like I'm an investment banker, I'm a college student, I'm growing health brands, whatever it is that you're doing. And it makes us feel important. But what it does is it pigeonholes us into a box and it doesn't allow us to evolve. So, like, what if you could just drop that identity? What if you could just become almost nothing so that you could become everything? And so, for you, like, how did you go about the process of dropping that identity? Was it just a bunch of introspective work or was there specific experiences?
Yeah. So there's one that I will come back to of my personal experience that was the real eye opener for me. But going on to what you're saying about the desire to grasp for identities, people do it because it's easy. They are borrowing credibility from the things that they take their identity for, right? Someone will become an investment banker to say that they're an investment banker because there are connotations that come with being an investment banker. You join a fraternity because you borrow the credibility of those letters of Kappa Sigma, of Sigma Chi. You don't have to work for it. You are already assumed to be this type of person because you're part of that group. It's the same reason that people wear brands. I remember vividly sitting in one of my classes, and there's this kid, very nice kid, and but he was very quiet and he was very shy and he was very meek. And I looked at him, and I have a habit of psychoanalyzing people when they don't want to be psychoanalyzed. But I was kind of just looking at him. I remember spending like 30 minutes kind of just like staring at this guy. And you could tell that he had an identity crisis. He didn't know who he was. He didn't have a strong sense of self. But what did he have? He had stickers all over his laptop of all of these brands. He was wearing these specific brands on his hat and on his sweatshirt because he was borrowing the identity and the credibility of these brands. He knew that people would see him and they would make assumptions about who he was based off of those brands that he was borrowing. So I saw that and I was just like, man, that's lame. No offense to this guy, people do it because they are starving for an identity. But I would rather eat shit and I would rather be nobody for an extended period of time and slowly build my own identity than ever borrow credibility from anything else. And I will never pigeonhole
Mm,
myself. That's why I don't even say that like I'm a health creator because health is just one component. At the end of the day, like I'm just sharing my ideas and, health is a component of that because it's a component of my life. In terms of what was the one thing that I really like the time that I really noticed um, was when I was in like building software. I was in cybersecurity for a while. I had like a software company, and I was so desperate for a professional identity. Then, like, what am I really? Like, am I? Because initially, I'm like, I'm a marketer, and then I was like, I'm a product development guy, right? Because you're wearing so many hats in the startup world. And I remember it's like for 3 months, I was convinced that like my real identity was like user experience design. And I was just like obsessed with it. It was everything that I was. I changed my bio to user experience designer, UX designer, and shit like that. And then 3 months went by and I got bored of it. And that was kind of like the final straw because I did that like 7 times. I'm like, fuck it. Like, I'm no longer ever classifying myself. I'm just doing the thing in the present moment. And that's okay. I realized the one thing that is true to my identity is the fact that I like acquiring knowledge really rapidly and then getting to a threshold where I've had enough and moving on. And then you kind of extract that identity. It's like, your identity is not the thing you're doing. Your identity is the reason behind you doing that thing, right? So a lot of
mm,
people attach their
mm.
identity to a sport, right? They're the football player. That was their identity throughout high school and then throughout college. And then they go to college, they play football there. And then once they get out of college, they're like, fuck, I didn't make it to the big league. My identity is a football player. What do I do now? Coach little league, right? Do I come and become a strength and conditioning coordinator? Or do I just go fuck off, become an alcoholic, and kind of just wallow in mediocrity because I've never been able to expand on that identity? But then you've got the guys that look deeper and they said, hey, I love football. Football is a big part of my life, but my identity is not a football player. My identity is someone who loves camaraderie, who loves teamwork, who loves winning, who loves the competition aspect. And they're able to abstract those core components and then apply it to a new domain. And now the guys that I'm thinking of directly that did this are crushing it in finance. They're crushing it in private equity. They're crushing it in their own business because they were able to extrapolate.
Dude, I fucking love that. It's almost like you just told my life story without knowing it, actually. So I was the college football player, and that was my
Yeah.
entire identity. And I ended up having a bunch of injuries, decided to stop playing. And the real catalyst actually for me to stop playing was a psilocybin mushroom trip that helped me drop my identity and realize, holy shit, this label I'd been defining myself as to like gain status, gain popularity, whatever it was actually limiting my entire human potential because I was putting myself in this box. And so after that moment, I started to look ahead to people 10, 20, 30 years ahead of me that were the football players, that were the D1 athletes. and they were never able to let that identity go. And so I think that's why you see, like, I'd be curious to know the numbers, but it might be like 50% of American males that are like 40 to 60 years old. What is their main source of purpose? What is their main source of enjoyment, excitement? It's actually watching other younger people playing football on the television because that's all they knew about themselves. And so I wrote an article about this one time. Like, I might even write a book someday called Exiting the Arena, like how athletes can drop their identities and find a new pursuit that gives them meaning in their life. And I think you hit it on the head. It's looking one level deeper than the sport. So, yeah, it was football on the surface, but what was it really about football for me? It was the team, it was the strategy, it was the planning, it was actually like the creativity of being able to be scrambling out of the pocket and making plays. So I love that. For
Yeah.
you, no, I'll let you go if you were going to say anything.
No, I was just going to agree. I knew that you played football, so I knew you were going to resonate with that.
Yeah, no, you hit it exactly on the head. I loved it. And for you, because of course you're very big into health right now, was there a sport that you were big into throughout your youth and childhood, high school, that you have found that there's like a layer deeper that is translated into what you're doing now?
That's really interesting. Because I was thinking about that when you were explaining your experience. I think throughout my childhood, I was never obsessed with any of those core things, right? Like I played sports and I was good at sports, but I was never just overwhelmingly obsessed with it where it became my entire identity, right? I was good enough to get on the team. I was good enough to play, but I didn't care, right? I never cared about it. I never showed up early. I never was like the first one there. I think the only thing that I was really obsessed with at that point was like fitness, right? But even then, I wasn't just doing like weightlifting. I didn't get obsessed and like classify myself as a bodybuilder. I just liked exploring like what my body was capable of. So that has resonated and hasn't left until this day. But like I think the constraints on what that is so flexible because I wasn't following a sport. There were no pigeonholing there because it was an explorative process. And I think that's the difference. That's why I'm someone who's very inconsistent. I rarely stay in the same place for longer than 45 days because I get bored. But I've been able to train literally every week for the last decade without failing and without utilizing willpower because I kept it open as an explorative process. When you're playing football, there's not a lot of exploration that can go on there, right? You can't just like one day be like, I've been a center for the last decade. Like, let me go switch it up and play quarterback. Maybe you
Yeah.
could, but it's not as open ended. It's not as self directed. So I think for me, I was always very self directed when I was younger. And that it made me incapable to completely assimilate with any group. I mean, I remember in high school it was like that because I was never really I wasn't a hockey guy, I wasn't a lacrosse guy, I wasn't a football guy. I was kind of just like in between all of those groups and doing my own thing. And then in college, with the fraternity life and stuff like that, yeah, I was in the fraternity. I did a lot of the fraternity life stuff. Then I got bored and then I kind of moved out of it. So I was kind of in between. I was always in that in between space, which was kind of annoying. And, I think that forces you to come up with your own identity and be comfortable with exploring. But no, I never did because I was never, it was almost like a feeling of being never fitting in fully, just
Mm.
fitting in enough to like have friends and fitting in enough to like do the things, but never having a full like feeling of adherence. And I do think that I found that in jujitsu, in martial arts. That was the one sport that I played where it was like I was immediately good at it and I was better than my contemporaries. And it felt so good because I always felt inferior in sports in high school. But when it came to martial arts, I just felt superior. I had this feeling of like, man, I'm really fucking good. And because it was so self directed, it was so self guided, nobody was telling me how to play the game. I was building my own game. And I think that I got to that point like I think that is different because it is such an act of self-discovery in and of itself, the martial arts game. And with martial arts, I'm not confined to one format. Like I'm not confined to just being a jiu-jitsu guy. I'm not confined to just being a Muay Thai guy, like a striker. You can just meld between all of them. So it gives you that amount of leniency and self-discovery. And it's a single person sport, right? It's an individual sport. So to answer your question, I'm thinking about it as we speak, but no. And I think a lot of that was just like not bothering to ever pigeonhole myself.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to that hunter type personality trait that you talk about. And I have this thread idea. I don't know when I'm going to write it, if I'm going to write it, but it's like imagine we were back a couple thousand years, what would your role have been within the tribe? Whereas for you, you have this very exploratory, I'm going to go on my own, I'm going to forage my own path, I'm going to go hunt, right? I think for me, like if I was living back in the tribal days, I might have been like the one who maybe kind of sat back and was just like thinking or like planning and strategizing and stuff like that. So with the hunter type personality, I'm curious about it because I don't think it's me, but I want to learn more about it. What would you say are those defining character traits of a hunter type, and how could somebody know if that's their inherent nature?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you use that mental model. This idea of like, what would my role be in a tribal setting, right? Because for the large majority of human existence, as us being anatomically identical to the way that we are now, we evolved within the context of tribes, right? So our sense of self was oftentimes not just with the individual, it was with the group that we were in, right? Just like your sense of self is oftentimes transposed onto your significant other, right? To your children. Like that expanded to an entire tribe. So everyone played a role, right? That's why our expansion into the agricultural society, where that role became bigger, was a lot easier than if wolves tried doing that, because like we like had those distinct roles. So it's good to spend that time and think like, what would my role be throughout every period of history? Can you learn about anthropology and evolutionary biology, and can you identify those periods and ask yourself like, what would I be? Like, who would you be in the Renaissance era? Right? Would you be a bard? Right? Would you be a witch doctor? Would you be a lancer? Who would you be? And really try to conceptualize that, because that's going to give you a good sense of self. And most importantly, it's going to romanticize the self identity process, which in my opinion is very, very important. I romanticize the shit out of it because like I run through the jungle. I'm like, man, I'm a fucking, I'm a tribesman right now. And like that is important. Humans conceptualize the world that we live in via stories. We give our brain way too much credit. Our frontal lobe is barely catching on to how existence works. That's why optical illusions are so easy, because our brain's still trying to conceptualize what this world is. Now, we were able to overcome that deficiency via storytelling. So we're primed to understand the world via stories, utilize those stories to get a better sense of self. Your question, what was your question? Oh, the hunter type.
Hunter type, yeah.
Yeah. So the hunter type and the way that I utilize it is this explanation for ADHD like tendencies. And I want to go out and say, first of all, there's a distinction that needs to be made between like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and dopamine deficiency disorder, right? Dopamine depletion syndrome, whatever you want to call it. ADHD is just a bundle of symptoms, right? So we'll go over those symptoms and what each of them are and how they could correlate to you being better at hunting, having a higher chance of survival and success in the hunter-gatherer context. But first I want to preface: everyone's like, "Oh, everyone has ADHD nowadays." TikTok's giving me ADHD. I don't think everyone has ADHD. I think ADHD it's just a bundle of symptoms. It's a disorder, so it doesn't actually classify the root cause. But a lot of people's brains are messed up from a myriad of reasons, right? I think first and foremost, all of the environmental toxins that we're being exposed to are causing the neurodegeneration and developmental issues in our brains. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is we're quite literally destroying our dopaminergic systems. Dopamine is excitotoxic. Too much dopamine will downregulate your dopamine receptors. So if you're on TikTok all day, yeah, you're going to have ADHD-like symptoms because your dopaminergic system is just not functioning properly. Now, I do believe there is a subsect of people typically classified as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that actually are just this neurological type that was a lot more effective and had a lot more use and application in that hunter-gatherer context, but is now a maladaptive trait. So think about the typical person with ADHD, right? They're very intuitive focused, right? Like they're not really good at making rational decisions, but they always seem to have like this sixth sense. They're really good at pattern recognition. It's like their mind goes faster than the frontal lobe orchestrator. So they just have all these wacky ideas. They're very nonlinear thinkers. They're highly distractible, right? So when I'm sitting here right now, like I can hear all of the noises going on. I can't weed those out. And in this context, that's really bad, right? And my distractibility, my ability to drop everything and go do something else, it doesn't serve me in this agricultural industrial environment. But picture you, or picture a hunter like 50,000 years ago in the woods foraging berries, right? And you're hyper distractible. You can't weed out all of those noises. You hear a stick crack or a stick crack in the distance. Like you're going to hear that immediately. You're going to be able to turn around, see that it's a predator coming to kill you. Like you're going to be able to act faster than someone who maybe can tone that out and is a little bit more focused on picking weeds or whatever a farmer would do, right? Same goes for if you were doing something like tanning a hide, and then you see like a prey, right, like an antelope or something, the ability for you to drop everything and rapidly task switch and focus all of your energy on that one activity and hyper focus on that activity, like all of these are very effective traits in that context, right? The ability for rapid pattern recognition. Back in the day, we didn't have time to make a rational decision whether or not that person coming over the hillside was going to kill us or was going to be friends with us. So it was all about rational pattern recognition, or excuse me, intuitive pattern recognition that would garner those decisions. That is something that we see with people with ADHD, the neuroatypical, that we don't see as much in the more agriculturally minded people. So those are the few of the components. I recommend anyone interested in that to read The Hunter Farmer Hypothesis by Tom Hartman. It's a great way to reframe this idea of they call it a learning disorder, which in some people it is, like some people it surely is, but for me, ADHD was not a learning disorder. If anything, like school was super easy because it was a game, right? You gamify it. But anyway, that's the Hunter Farmer Hypothesis in a nutshell.
Mm. And with these hunter types, with these people that are more inclined to intuition, rapid context switching, living, I see it as a living on the edge.
Yeah.
Do you think those types are more do you think they'd be better suited for an entrepreneurial endeavor than like a typical 9 to 5 type of job? Because I know a lot of friends like from childhood, college that have always been ADHD. Like I know they're on ADHD stuff, but they're like putting themselves into a 9 to 5 very robotic type of role. So I wonder if they'd be better suited going their own path.
Yes, I mean, listen, going your own path is difficult. It requires a certain level of mental fortitude that not everybody has. And ADHD in this hunter type, it's not coinciding with like intelligence quota, right? And some of these other like spectrums, right? It's a spectrum. And then on that spectrum, you have like people that are really high capability and people that are low capability, right? Just like you have like a normal, like neurotypical person, like just because you're neurotypical doesn't mean you're going to have this level of IQ or that level of IQ. There's a lot of interdependence. So, some people are probably going like forging your own path is difficult, right? It takes a certain level of fortitude, risk taking, which a lot of hunter types have, and the desire for spontaneity. But yeah, I think that the typical 9 to 5 lifestyle is very draining and taxing on anyone who lives a more robust nomadic, is primed for a more like nomadic, spontaneous environment. So what do they have to do? They have to get jacked up on diet meth, amphetamines and dextroamphetamines, just to function normally, right? Just to get by. So they are working so hard. They are literally destroying the same part of their brain that they have a supposed deficiency in, which is that frontal lobe, that frontal cortex, with these amphetamines just to be average, right? So if you want to be average, yeah, that's fine. Go do that. But I think my biggest fear always was like lost or, not reaching my potential. It was always my biggest fear is like
Mm,
not reaching self-actualization and realizing that if I have to scrape by just to be normal, that probably means that I could do pretty well doing something abnormal.
yeah. Yeah, I love that you hit on that theme of the biggest fear for you was not reaching your potential. I wrote my latest newsletter on that exact piece because that's been my biggest fear for so long too. And so on this theme of like self-actualization, I mean, how old are you right now, by the way?
I'm 25.
Oh, you're 25. Okay. So we're still both pretty young, so we got a long way to go in terms of self-actualization, but
I'll be 26 in
what
2 months though. So
okay, so basically
I'm
26.
25 and three
Um
quarters.
got you. So, in terms of like the self-actualized version of yourself, who is Noah Ryan like completely self-actualized? And what is the gap between you now and that version of you?
I don't know, man. I just go with the flow. You kind of spin your wheels when you're obsessed with who could I be? It's good to
Mm,
fantasize about it. It's good to have that in mind. But every single goal that I set, I achieved when I stopped worrying about it and kind of just went with the flow. Because I used to be
mm,
so hard nosed about things that I wanted. Like, it's so funny looking back. Because, listen, I started creating content online as a form of procrastination, right? I had a marketing agency and I was doing a lot of work outside of that to like fund my lifestyle of being a beach bum, which isn't very hard to fund. Uh, and I had a lot of free times on my hand, but even when I didn't, I wanted to just procrastinate. So I was interested in certain things. A really common hunter type phenomenon is when you have something you have to do, it's like fucking pulling teeth to get you to do it. You feel like you're backed in a corner and you lash out in other ways. So I found very early on that like procrastination was where all of my best things came from. Like I started my first businesses by procrastinating on school. I learned how to cook by procrastinating on doing homework and by procrastinating on those businesses. So all of my greatest things came like in this effortless format of procrastination. But anyway, like, creating content was that component there. I'm sorry, I completely forgot your question. I got carried away.
No, you're good. I like that topic too about not attaching so much to this idea of who you want to be. Like for me, I started writing online without any intention or any goal. It was like I'm backpacking. I don't know what to do with my time. I'm going to start journaling. Oh, I'm like reading some interesting books. I'm listening to podcasts. Why don't I just share these ideas with people? And it's like this art of non-forcing or non-doing, which seems to be a common theme for a lot of people that get into the game of content creation, whatever you want to call it. Whereas what I see a lot is like the people who find a video and they're like, oh, I can create content and like make millions of dollars and have millions of followers. They put it on such a pedestal that they never are able to actually reach it because they're just subconsciously putting themselves down and seeing this image of who they have to be.
Yeah, man, it's so like I could never do that. And the idea of creating content for an outcome, some people can operate that way, right? Like I know some people, they're like, I would not create content if I didn't know exactly what I was getting out of it. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. If that's how you operate and you're self-aware enough to know that's how you perform best, then go do that. But I know for a fact that I perform best when I'm doing something for the sake of doing it, right? Like working out. I always come back to that. I come back to fitness because I've done it every single day, more or less, for the last 10 years without ever applying any willpower or effort because I'm doing it for its own sake. I'm not planning to get anything out of it. I'm just doing it because I enjoy the process, right? And same with creating
Yeah.
content. Now, the question that you did ask was about what is that I like self-actualized version of Noah. I don't know, and I don't really care. But I do know what like optimized Noah looks like, and I know what unoptimized Noah looks like, right? Like what is the best version of myself in this present moment, and what is the worst version of myself? And I keep tabs on that, right? Because whenever I fall back into that worst version of myself, which I'm very clear about because I've been there a lot, I know that change needs to be made. I'm going to go do something drastic. I'm going to go switch up my routine. I'm going to go pull from this toolbox of things that I know that can take me from like rut Noah to optimize Noah. And a few of those things is going to be different for everyone. But when I'm like when I'm my best self, like I just like feel this incredible magnetic charisma. Like I'll go outside and like I'll just have these incredible interactions with people organically. People will come up to me and start conversations with me. I'm happy. I'm extremely positive, right? I'm really pumped and I enjoy doing things for the sake of doing them. I'm super helpful. Like everything feels like play and the colors are brighter. All of these things, like I just noticed them and I made a very clear distinction of that in my head. And then what does suboptimal Noah look like? I get depressed, right? I get depressed. I'm like relatively, I'm very irritable. I'm relatively antisocial. I don't make eye contact with people down on the street. It feels like I'm pushing people away from an energetic standpoint. I don't want to do a lot of the things that I want to do. Like if I was in a rut right now, I probably wouldn't want to do this podcast. And I'm just miserable. So I have a very and like I'm trying to explain it, but it's more about a feel, right? It's about that
Mhm.
intuitive feel, and I can feel when I'm in either of those states. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. But yeah, self-actualized version of me, like everything is just enjoyable and effortless. Like I'm just happy. I look different. Like I feel different. So yeah, it's about just making sure that you're always at least observant when you hit those ruts because they are inevitable, and then building that toolbox that gets you out of it.
Yeah, the ruts piece is really interesting. And it's something that I've been throughout these last 18 months of like writing online, building business, doing all this stuff. There's all these high points where you're like, oh, everything's going perfectly. I'm in flow all the time. The podcast is going great. Conversations flowing. Writing is effortless. The workouts are great. But then you inevitably slip back into those ruts. And what I'm trying to become more conscious of what are the things that actually pull me out of that high state and back into a lower state. So for you, like, have you identified some of those triggers or some of those slippery slopes that send you back down into a negative spiral of some sorts?
Yeah, sometimes it's inevitable. It just happens, right? Storms come, rains come, non-ironically, the weather is a huge component. So it was cloudy for like 2 days here, and I was feeling fucking extremely lethargic. But I think there's a multitude of factors there. Lack of socialization. Sometimes things will just send you off your rocker. Certain losses, certain like follies, like mess ups that you did, and you knew that you could do better. Those are all kind of components as well. Some people are just more afflicted by those things. Those are some factors there. I find that when I don't get shit done, when I don't get shit done that I said that I was going to get done, that really wears on me. Because that ruins the kind of confidence and commitment you have in being someone who does what they say they're going to do. So I think that's a really big factor there, and a lot of it's just like self-imposed, like negative self-talk, being hypercritical for no reason. But I think a lot of it's a little bit more nuanced than that. There's like a biochemical component to it for sure, you know. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it just happens, man. It just happens. A catalyst will start the snowball, and then you snowball to a certain point, and then it's up to you to get out of that rut. Like you got yourself into that rut, it's up to you to get yourself out of it.
Yeah, I see in myself when I slip into a rut or a lower state, I actually see it as like a slip in consciousness, like a slip into a lower state of vibration or consciousness. So do you see it? Because I know you're very focused on the biological aspect, the physical aspect. Do you see it at all through a spiritual, metaphysical consciousness lens?
Yeah, I do. I try not to rely on that, but at the end of the day, like we want to make a distinction between metaphysical and biological, right? But at the end of the day, those are two like representations of the same system. Like the metaphysical components have direct representation in like your biological makeup, right? Like your neurotransmitters, your brain waves, like all those can be altered just by your mindset and your state of mind in that present moment, which is what you want to call like metaphysical. I don't know what the vernacular is for that, but yeah, they're both deeply interconnected. I think at the end of the day, there are so many things that, I take a really heavily biological and rational approach to, but that's really just my desire to want to have a rational explanation for something that cannot be explained rationally. At the end
Mm.
of the day, I think I'm kind of at the point where everything just happens for a reason. And I do get into that because I do notice like when there was a period, like 6 months ago, probably yeah, about 8 months ago, like a 5 month period where life was just so incredible and dandy, and like the continuity or the synchronicities that were occurring were too prevalent to ignore. The way that I kind of just felt in a non biological sense was just too significant to ignore.
And what was that period like? What was happening? Like what synchronicities were coming up?
Always looking at my phone and seeing like the multitude of numbers, which I never really resonated with, but then I just started seeing them, and then once I fell out of that state, I stopped seeing them. But it's funny because I was really neurotic about my health and biohacking when I was living somewhere else here in Mexico, and then I moved to the beach, and I kind of just gave up on everything. So I'm like, it's not going anywhere. I'm spinning my wheels here. So I stopped all the rapid supplementation. I stopped all of like the neuroticism, and I kind of just let myself loose. I was surfing every day. I was drinking. I was socializing. I was partying. And man, life was awesome. Like I somehow miraculously just got into incredible shape. That's when my Twitter took off. And I was just like not doing anything. I was just like casually living super casually. Everything was performing incredible. Business was great. Everything was great. And that was when I literally just like let go. Quite literally let go because I was so distraught about not being able to accomplish anything. I'm like, fuck it. I'm literally going to go be a bum. And in my pursuit of being a bum, I just ended up essentially transcending into a much more effective version of myself, which is super interesting.
That is fascinating. That is so fascinating. This has been a topic on my mind over the past like 2 weeks because for the last 3 months, I've been so nose down, building business, building projects, like clinging to it, trying to control everything. But over the past 2 weeks, I've realigned more so to just letting go and surrendering. And then things start to happen even better. Like I get Danko on the podcast. You asked to come on just like coincidentally, I have 3 free hours in the middle of the day. And you hit me up in the DM. You're like, yo, you want to do the podcast? It's like crazy. When you're not trying and you're not forcing, things flow.
Yeah. Yeah, shit really just falls in your lap when you stop chasing it. It's almost a near unanimous thing, right? Like you get the job when you stop wanting to get the job. You get the girl when you stop chasing the girl. It just happens, and it's happened so many times in my life that I can't deny it. Every time I try really hard for something, I never get it. The second I just give up and go with the flow, things go swimmingly. And it's so funny, like it's so oxymoronic as well, paradoxical. Like looking back at some photos, like I'm not drinking right now. I'm going to bed super early. I'm super dialed with all of my like health and stuff. But looking back, like 6 months ago, I was going out and I was like partying like 4 times a week. Sleep schedule was not very good. I was drinking a lot, espresso martinis all day, and I was in such good shape. I was just like literally like I looked so non-natty. I was just shredded. I was massive. Like life was so good. Everything was great. My skin was perfect, and I was like smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. And I was like, yo, that's low vibrational. But like that was the highest vibrations I've ever had. And then I cut it out, and I like that stuff goes away. So I think there's a certain level of spontaneity that's very odd. And I can't even begin to try to explain it.
So right now that you are very dialed, going to bed early, on top of your health, more structured potentially, why have you cut the partying, smoking cigarettes, all of that type of stuff out right now?
It ran its course, you know, and I think a lot, like, I don't have a problem with that stuff, but the issue is people become dependent on it as like a sense of like purpose, like a sense of enjoyment. And like I get really bored of stuff really quickly. So a
Mm.
lot of people, they will do something and they can't let it go, right? No, like you were talking about the football player that spends his entire life and identity cheering on some college team of 20-year-olds. Like, why are you going to football games, you 40-year-old man? Go tend to your family. Move on, you know, move on. So I just moved on. Like, it's seasons, right? And I just got over that season. I was done. I got what I wanted out of it, and I moved on. And maybe I'll reincorporate it in some way or another. But you know, there was other aspects of my life that I wanted to progress on, and those weren't necessarily as conducive to living super super carefree.
Mm. Yeah, it's all about seasons. I think I'm going to enter a season of not degeneracy, but more free flowing this summer. Like, I'm really looking forward to it because I've been so structured and dialed for a while. I think it's all about like just navigating those different waves over time. And that's how you experience the fullness of life too. If you lived one way forever, where would the joy be in that, right? You have to try new things. So I, I admire that about you, about how you just move around constantly, like every month, 2 months. But I want to know, like, because when I was doing a little bit of the nomading, I was in Costa Rica, Buenos Aires, etc. I noticed a downside to that was the transactional nature, it seemed, of relationships and not being able to develop relationships over time. And I know you talked about how social interactions so important for everything, for mental health, spiritual health, everything. So how do you navigate that with moving around so much and still being able to foster those relationships?
Yeah. First and foremost, you know, I do live very nomadic, but it's a cyclical nomadicism. And in my opinion, cyclical nomadicism is the most evolutionary accurate. The nomadic tribes, they did move around a lot, but they followed the herds, and the herds went to the same spot year after year. Sure, they made little detours occasionally, but over a 12-month period, they were up north, then they were south, maybe they spent a little time in the west, and then they went back up north. So I do very cyclical, right? And I think building communities, it's the same thing online as it is in person. It takes work, but it is enjoyable. So like I come here to this town that I'm in right now, which I come back to a lot. And man, my network is so great. When I was living in Mexico City, my network was incredible. Like just as like a 20 something year old kid, I was able to build such a powerful network. And I think a lot of it is like not worrying about networking, just like honestly enjoying spending time with people, getting to know people. You know, it helps when you speak the language as well. But like today, you know, I woke up, I went to my coffee shop that I go to all the time. I had a great conversation with the guys that work there, you know, hear about their weekend, their family, learn so much about them. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
this incredible relationship. It's non-transactional. Then I go to my butcher, right? And my butcher's making some, you know, tallow fried beef heart. He gives me some, you know, his daughter works at the like the cashier stand, and like she gave me too much cash, so I like came around and gave him the cash back. Like it's just these incredible fulfilling relationships that are outside the typical confines of what you think of when you think of like a community or relationship. Most people think of community and they're like, oh, just my boys, you know, hanging out with my boys. But the reality is a strong community is very eclectic, right? Like being able to interact with so many different people, right? Having all of these different groups of people that satisfy different social needs and wants, right? I have people that are my age. I have people that I do business with that I have incredible relationships with, right? I have this incredible network that I've acquired through creating content online that have people that really align with me, and I spend hours on the phone talking with them. And then I have the people in the real world. But even here, it's like if you put yourself out there and if you become a social person, oh, look at it, bird. A
I
social
know. I
person.
noticed that.
I'm the type, dude. I like if this was 20,000 years ago, I'd grab my spear and eat it for lunch. But anyway, moving on. I like you got to get good at just being out there and like connecting with people because that is a skill. Social skills are a skill, and skills can be developed, right? So I
Mm.
think it's a skill. It's all self-driven. You know, the worst thing that someone can do is move to a new place, and if in the first week they don't make a deliberate effort to build some sort of friendship, social community foundation, they're going to be relegated to being a recluse. It's a lot harder to build that network or community when you've been in the same place for a long time. But if you go somewhere new, everything's uncomfortable. So it's a lot easier for you to insert yourself into these communities and like build that network. So it's great. I'm super grateful for the communities that I've been able to build, for the networks and connections that I have, and realizing on a long enough time frame, the most important thing in life is going to be maintaining relationships. So spending time, calling my buddies from high school, calling my buddies from college, and keeping those relationships alive, seeing how they're doing, keeping up to date with all of that, and just being very altruistic as well. Once again, going back to this concept of us evolving within a tribal context. So yeah, like a selfish person is going to probably have a higher rate of survival than an altruistic person in an isolated environment if it was just 1v1. But a tribe of altruists is going to have a lot higher chance of survival than a tribe of selfish people. So, being more altruistic, it makes you feel good. Anytime, we're talking about getting out of the rut, one of the best things I do to get out of ruts is to go spend time with those people and just do nice things, right? Like that's my
Hmm.
favorite thing to do. Go to a coffee shop, tip fat, take one of my friends out to lunch or something like that. And it always makes me feel better.
Yeah, dude. Those two topics have been so top of mind. Like today I wrote a thread on how to overcome social anxiety, and yesterday I wrote a post on like how to develop an abundance mindset, and you hit on so many of the things that I just wrote about. Like tip the barista an extra $2. Like get over that fear of like, oh, I don't want to tip $2. It's gonna make you feel better. It's gonna raise your vibration. Like pay for your friend's lunch, pay for the Uber, do all that stuff. I love that. And I do also love like one of my favorite things I do every day. I walk to the coffee shop in the morning when it opens, and I'm usually one of the first ones there. And me and the baristas are such good friends. Like we have like a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation just about whatever before I get into my work. And the rest of my day, I'm in flow state because I've been in flow state with that conversation. Whereas when I had higher social anxiety, I'd be like, can I just have my black coffee? And then I wouldn't say anything else. Now I'm in like a lower state the rest of the day. So it's so valuable to build those relationships, the micro interactions. Like I think
Yeah.
you build social confidence with micro interactions and then those stack on top of each other.
I couldn't agree more. And this is the biggest thing when it comes to being a sociable person. I think everybody, I don't care if you're introverted or extroverted, like oftentimes being introverted is an excuse to not know how to socialize. That is going to be the biggest indicator of success is your ability to interact with other people, right? And you do that by getting the reps in, right? I used to jokingly say, Riz everybody, like go out and just be like learn how to be likable, learn how to be interested in other people, and approach it with a growth mindset. And I want to clarify what is the difference between approaching this with a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. You approach it with a fixed mindset, you go and you have a conversation with that barista, you stumble on your words, you sound like an idiot. Someone with a fixed mindset is gonna be like, man, I fucking suck at this. I'm gonna go back in my room and play video games and watch porn. Someone with a growth mindset, which is way more fun, in my opinion, is going, messing up, knowing that they're going to forget about that conversation entirely, right? Because no one thinks about you as much as they think about themselves. And then just identifying what you can do differently next time. And now it's a growth process. It's enjoyable. It's a game. And that's really the way to do it. And that is how you just grow so rapidly and you become a highly sophisticated, socially interactable person.
Mm. And what would you say are some of those main defining things about being likable to other people? Because I think it's a sticking point for a lot of people.
Yeah. Be interested in them. That's the only
Yeah,
thing. Don't talk about
yeah,
yourself. Just be interested in them.
yeah,
That's the key. People
100%.
love it when you're interested in them. That's why I love coming on podcasts because you're interested in what I'm doing. I love it, right? Like
Exactly.
it feels so good. We want that recognition. We want people to be curious about ourselves. We love talking about ourselves. So understand that and ask yourself, what do you want out of this? What do you want out of this interaction, right? Like, do you want to brag to someone about who you are, or do you want to be interested in them? And it's not this fake, forceful thing where it's like, oh, I got to come up with questions. You just need to learn how to be genuinely interested in other people. Because once you're interested in other people, it opens up this door to being exposed to all these new ideas and these new psyches that you can then adopt as your own. So I think that's really the key is just being interested in other people for the sake of being interested in other people.
Yeah. I mean, it's so cliche, but the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, I feel like it's just required reading for how to master social skills. Before I read that book, like I was experiencing a lot of social anxiety for a long time. I read that book, I realized I'm thinking way too much about myself. What if I just put all of my attention on them, just ask them questions, become extremely curious, and then it's so funny how they become interested in you by you being interested in them. Like that's why I love doing the podcast too, because I've realized I have this curious side to me that I was suppressing because I was anxious. But like, if I could just get on a podcast and ask all these interesting people just what they're doing, how they think about the world, like, I'd rather spend my time no other way. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like play.
Yeah, it really does. And yeah, you're a great interviewer. I'm hypercritical, so I'm always like, fuck, I'm shit at interviewing. Like I'll go back and I'll listen to them like, you talk too much, Noah. Stop talking about yourself. Ask this person questions. But yeah, it really is. And, this goes back to what we were discussing earlier, vaguely. Your life will be so much easier if you just optimize for doing things that give you energy, right? Everything that I do now are things that give me energy, which enables me to do more of it, which enables me to have better results. People think that they need to do the hard stuff. People think that they need to do the grind and the hustle because they align their identity with that, right? They take pride in the fact that they work hard and that they're busy. Good for you, buddy. Like, what do you want? Do you want to feel good about yourself in some weird, conflated ego manner, or do you want results and do you want a good life? So, yeah, optimize for things that give you energy and get good at tracking those things. I've removed everything from my life, more or less, that is just detracting from my energy, that is putting me in those ruts. Administrative tasks, boring work, scheduling, all of that stuff. I just asked myself, what would it look like if it were easy? Well, it would look really easy if I spent most of my time thinking and talking with other people, and if I did things spontaneously, like this podcast. So I did it. I haven't noticed any detractions from it, and it's enabled me to do it longer.
That's good to know. That's good to hear. Yeah, you're living in complete alignment, which is awesome. And it's all about like slowly identifying what are those things that pull you out of alignment and pull you out of presence and pull you out of flow state and just adding more. So for me, the ideal life is like read, write, talk to interesting people, ask them questions, and build projects and help people build creative streams of income on the internet. And so if I can do that every day, like my life is complete in alignment. I don't need anything else. And so for you right now, being only 25, about to be 26, how do you
25 and three quarters.
envision
You're right.
25 and three quarters? How do you envision business evolving for you, say over like the next year to couple years?
Mm, it's funny. The less I think about it, the better it performs. Once I stopped thinking
Yeah.
about money, that's when all the money kind of showed up. Um, I don't know. I'm not even looking at it from like a business standpoint as much as I'm looking at it from an impact standpoint. I know what my ideal lifestyle is. I know the life that I want to live, and I know the life that I'm comfortable with living. I think a lot of people, they get onto the hedonic treadmill. They start playing games that they don't even want to play. And it's so funny because I have a lot of friends that are hyper successful, real go getters, making a lot more money than I am, a lot more money than 99% of the population. They're all unhappy. There's some that aren't. There's a lot that are extremely unhappy and they're lost, right? And I'm like, why do you think that scaling your business, 2x is going to be the thing that fills that hole? They're like, well, I don't, but I don't know what else to do, right? So they maintain
Mm-hmm.
themselves with busy work so they don't have to think about what's actually going to make them happy. Listen, like I'm not saying that I have the key to like happiness. I definitely don't. But like I have been able to make substantial improvements in my life and my enjoyment and quality of life by just giving myself that time to think. But in terms of like what do I want from business, I don't really know. To be honest, I don't really care. For better or worse, I've just never been able to make myself money minded. When I was really scaling my agency and I had like a really solid team, when I was working in software, I was doing a lot of great work, but that novelty very quickly wore off. And I knew once that wore off that I'm not interested in this game. This is not the game that's going to
Mm-hmm.
get me to that next level because I've already gotten everything I want from it. When it comes to impact, I always feel good when I make impact, right? And the more impact I make, the better I feel. So that is a worthy thing for me to pursue. And with impact comes value, and with value comes, monetization potential. So I'm not really
Mm.
worried about it. I just know if I continue following impact, that's going to be the best route. The second that I try to focus more on the monetary side of things, I always end up getting burnt out and I don't enjoy it. And I end up worse off than I was when I started. So
100%. I love that frame. And it's something I need to remind myself of too, especially for every entrepreneur out there, somebody who's just starting off. Like you get into it, you just, you can get on this rabbit chase of just more and more income, but at what cost, right? I was talking with somebody today about people will sacrifice all these things in their life that would make them happy to just see a number go up in their bank account. And it's just pure delusion. It's just absolute delusion. It's not living in reality. So I love the impact game more. And the funny thing is, you usually make more money from that lens. So I'll end it here with the last question on the topic of impact. What impact do you want to have on the world over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years? I know it's far out, but I like thinking
yeah,
about it like this.
it's so funny. I'm sure my understanding of the world will be so drastically different, 5 years from now, let alone 10, 20 years from now. I think the most important thing, though, is just maintaining authenticity and transparency in terms of how I perceive the world. right? And not pigeonholing myself, not going in line with a narrative that I pushed just because that was like my golden ticket. We see it a lot with creators where they become big for some specific thing, right? Some lifestyle, some diet, some mental model or framework, and they keep pushing it even though they may not believe in it anymore, right? Like vegan influencers who are no longer vegan, but their names like vegan gains or some shit. So they feel this necessity to continue with it to avoid cognitive dissonance. And the biggest thing for me is just to focus on continuing to be fully transparent, never sticking with something just because that's what's getting engagement. Because at the end of the day, engagement doesn't really matter. It's about impact and like depth versus breadth. So I think that's the biggest thing there. But I think the biggest thing that's been a consistent throughout my life, and especially throughout my content creation pursuit, if that's what you want to call it, is just thinking outside of the box on how you can make a better, like create a better life. It really does come down to lifestyle design. Of course I started posting, when I started posting, it was all about like supplements and health stuff, right? Because that's what I was really interested in. But now I barely talk about that stuff because that's no longer what I think is the next step in me living a better life and the most impact. So yeah, I think like the biggest thing is just like knowing that no one's going to come to save you. If you don't figure out the life that you want to live, someone is going to decide it for you. And being comfortable with taking those leaps and spending more time thinking and pondering and really identifying what do you want out of this life. The clock's ticking. Where do you want to allocate that time and what's really important? I think that's the big thing. It's like what's really important in the long term of things, and being brutally honest with it. I'm brutally honest with all my friends. Like it's just that's almost like a classifier. It's like I'm going to be brutally honest with you, and it's in your best interest. So take it. Take it. I don't want to be surrounded by yes men. I don't want to be a yes man for anybody. If anybody wants me to be a yes man, I don't care who they are. It's just not worth the relationship.
I fucking love it, dude. I can't wait to see where your brand and yourself evolve over like the next 5, 10 years. It's gonna be wild, especially if you keep evolving and iterating at this pace. It's gonna be
Yeah.
crazy.
Unless I go rogue and delete everything and move to the Cambodian jungle, which is probably in my cards pretty soon here.
That's crossed your mind going
Every
completely off
day,
the
dude.
map?
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
It's the non-attachment thing. I think knowing that like
Yeah.
at any day I can literally just stop. I don't think I want to because I'm never going to stop thinking, right? And it's about creating hobbies and activities that you have to do anyway. I'm going to think one way or another. I might as well find a way to make that thinking productive. I have to eat 3 meals every day. I might as well learn to enjoy cooking, right? I have to maintain some semblance of physical activity. I might enjoy the creative process. So all of my hobbies, to be honest, are things that I would have to do anyway, and I just made them fun in a growth process.
Mm. Yeah, you've completely gamified your life. It's
Truly,
genius.
it's because of all that Pokemon, dude. I loved video games as a kid. You want to know what it was? I
Interesting.
know we're wrapping up here, but what it was when I was building software and I was learning about gamification of apps and software of how to get people hooked. And I was like, motherfucker, all of these apps are doing this to me, right? I was like, God, that's why I'm obsessed with video games. So then I just took all those core components that I was implementing into our product and I just applied it to my life, and it worked swimmingly.
It's such a common theme for people that become ultra successful is they had some background in video games and then they realized they could actually turn their life into a video game. I think it's like almost unanimous with dudes probably around our age, like 20 to 30, who grew up playing video games. Like, why can't I turn myself into a character in the video game of life? I fucking love that frame. I might
Yeah,
name the podcast that title.
dude, you got to go create a character, right? You got to get creative with it. Get a haircut. I got the little mullet going. Got the
Looks
mustache.
sick.
Create a character. Up your stats.
Yeah.
It's all about that.
Yeah.
It's all about gamification. You got to glorify life. We comprehend the world that we live in via stories, so make it an interesting one.
Love it. Awesome, dude. Well, before we hop off, where can people find you at? What can they expect from you? Where should I
Yeah.
send them to?
Twitter at Noah Ryan Co. I've been spending a majority of my time on Substack. I found that tweeting for the last 2 years has relegated my thought to 240 characters. So I'm doing a lot more long form. www.noahryan.co. That's where I do all of my posting. So make sure to follow me there.
Awesome. I'll link that below. And actually, I do have one tiny question to end it. Since you're going more long form, this came to mind earlier. Is a book in your future? Have you ever thought about it?
Yeah, so I'm actually working on a book right now. It's a technical book on peptides, because once again, it's a lot easier to those are training wheels, right? It's training wheels for the book creating process. It's a big like because a few people were telling me like you got to create a book about all this stuff. I'm like, it's a lot of work. I'd rather just do something that's focused, value based. But yeah, peptide protocol coming, and then from there, like more and more long form. It's all about long form. It's just the progression, progression of impact.
I love it. Awesome, dude. Thank you for coming on. This was awesome. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This flew by. You're a great interviewer. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Appreciate it, Jack.
Thank you, man.